So welcome to our event tonight. I'm just so gratified that you all are tuning in. This conversation tonight about Indigenous communities and intersectional environmental ethics is urgent, it's timely, it's something we should all be invested in. And I'm just so glad we get to have this conversation. I'm Greg Johnson. I'm director of the Walter H. Capp Center for the Study of Ethics, Religion, and Public Life. I'm also a professor of religious studies here at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And I'm so pleased to be able to welcome Professor Kyle Whyte and Professor David Pellow tonight for this conversation. I'll give them a proper introduction in a moment, but these are two of the leading figures in their respective fields that happen to overlap, and for our purposes, that's just wonderful. Aside from being published many times over and doing all kinds of outreach work, these guys work across disciplines, both of them, and they've both held named chairs at different institutions, which is a claim to fame in its own right. For those of you joining us, including many students, thank you. Colleagues from various places and community members. We're grateful you're here. Thank you to our donors who make these events possible. I think it goes without saying, we can't wait for the day to welcome you all back in person to do this around a table with food in the proper way. So thanks for bearing with us under these conditions. I want to thank the team here at the Capp Center, Maeve DeVoy, Alma Mendoza, and Gregory Jarrett, who've worked hard to make this happen. And Gregory Jarrett, in particular, for years has helped coordinate the ethics forum of which this is a part, having to do with public policy. And I'm really eager for us in this conversation to come around to the traction of public policy. We've turned a corner, perhaps, collectively of late, but the question remains, how do we move forward, having turned the corner? I also want to thank our co-sponsor, and this is an entity called Counterpoint, Navigating Knowledge. And Professor Whyte and I have the honor of both sharing membership on the advisory board. It's an entity out of Berlin, Germany. It's on a think tank model effectively, and they host seminars, they have a weekly blog, they publish interesting things. So I encourage you to check out their website at Counterpoint, Navigating Knowledge. At this juncture, I want to offer a land acknowledgement. We here at UCSB and in Santa Barbara, we're on the lands of the Chumash peoples, on their territories, on the edge of their waters. They've been here a long time and they'll continue to be here. We need to honor that fact. And that brings us to our symposium topic, Ethics in Place, a symposium on Indigenous peoples and the renewal of a principled democracy. So how do we go beyond acknowledgement to engagement, to accountability? These are real issues that we face. I think wherever we are in the political spectrum, I think we all recognize that we're in trouble in terms of our democracy. This corner we may have rounded, that's one thing, but we sure know we're not out of the woods. Our democracy is imperiled in any number of ways, and so many of these are historical, right? Going back to land alienation, slavery, faulty immigration policies. We have to go back and rethink just what it is we're doing and who we are. And that's the spirit of this symposium, to talk about place and space, law, policy, accountability, ethics, and finally justice in these sorts of terms. We had two great events so far, and tonight we continue that conversation around environmental ethics and adding in difficult questions about solidarities, complementarities between different movements and peoples, raising questions about frictions between them when they emerge, not shying away from questions of race, class, and gender. And I have to acknowledge right here, it's a huge topic. This is my doing. Neither of our guests are responsible for such a huge framework. And of course, we can't possibly address all of what that framework might entail tonight, but I'm quite confident that we're going to open up some interesting angles of vision, some provocative questions, and we're really relying on you, the audience, for those questions. So the Q&A function, please use that to post up for us By 6 or a little bit thereafter, we'll get around to your questions, and that's very much part of the conversation we aspire to. Now, without further ado, let me introduce our two speakers, our conversation partners for tonight. First, Kyle Whyte. Kyle Whyte is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. He is Professor of Environment and Sustainability and George Willis Pack Professor at the University of Michigan. Previously, before this appointment, he was Professor of Philosophy and Community Sustainability and the Timnick Chair at Michigan State University. His research and engagement address moral and political issues concerning climate policy and Indigenous peoples, the ethics of cooperative relationships between Indigenous peoples and science organizations, and problems of Indigenous justice in public and academic discussions of food sovereignty, environmental justice, and the Anthropocene. As I already indicated, his work beyond the academy is extraordinary. The number of partnerships he's involved in is mind-blowing, whether these be government advisory boards, other tribal nations, scientific organizations. I just can't wait to hear more about some of that work. David Pellow is the Delson Chair and Professor of Environmental Studies here at UCSB, and he's also the chair of the program in Environmental Studies and director of the Global Environmental Studies Project. Previously, he was the Don Martindale Endowed Chair in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. His areas of specialization include issues concerning environmental justice, race and ethnicity, labor, social protest, animal rights, immigration, free trade agreements, and the global impacts of the high-tech industry. Both scholars have too many publications to mention here. I encourage you to check out their websites and read up. But for now, I just want to launch the conversation. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining us. Really looking forward to this. And let's turn to you, Professor Whyte, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Great, and thanks for the introduction, Greg, and awesome to hear about the series and what you all are doing and some of the different goals. And I really like the topic about intersectional environmental ethics and how it connects to environmental justice. And so I actually have a whole bunch of stuff planned to say, communicate and dialogue with you all. I think some of it I'll say maybe at the beginning, but then some of it I think I'm kind of prepared to discuss as there's more dialogue and back and forth, especially a lot of issues about coalitions between Indigenous people, Black people, and a number of other groups that we all share in the environmental justice movement. And so I do want to make sure that there's a chance to really discuss those issues as they're one component of intersectionality. But to begin with, just some introductory points I wanted to make about both the work that I do, but also some of the ideas that have been troubling me recently, and I've been talking to a lot of different audiences about, but like in totally different ways. And the troublesomeness has been growing and growing and growing. And so those ideas, which I think are very intersectional ideas, have to do with how some of the ethical issues and justice issues we face regarding the environment have a lot to do with our assumptions about the nature of time and how things occur within time. But to begin with, just a little bit about the work that I do. So as a Potawatomi person, I work in our original homelands in the Great Lakes region. I've really been devoted to supporting work that protects those aspects of the environment that are important to us, to Potawatomi or Anishinaabe people, but also to Indigenous people more broadly and the many communities that are allied with us. And so a lot of my work has been focused on, protecting traditional and sacred species, wild rice and sturgeon, others that matter to us in the Great Lakes region. And, remember those efforts, while sometimes me or other folks call them conservation efforts, right? They're really also environmental justice efforts, because, back in the day, we had, extremely complex environmental stewardship and management traditions for maintaining relationships with these species. It was built into the culture, into the economy, into the politics. But now, given how much has changed due to the, invasion and colonialism and racial capitalism and patriarchy of the United States, it's really made it challenging to maintain those relationships with many of these important, species or relatives, for Indigenous people. And so more specifically, I've been, particularly concerned about climate change. So like anywhere in the world, your capacity to relate to different plants or animals or insects, or right, whoever it is, or your relatives, right, landscapes, has a lot to do with, trends in the climate system. And so, in the Great Lakes region, we've definitely seen warming, and it's created destabilizations. It's created scenarios where, you get rain at the time of year that, like, you least want, rain, and then you don't get any rain when you really want rain. And that has all sorts of effects on, everything from, water levels and different types of habitats. We're also seeing issues that affect the timing of seasons. We're seeing the winter change because of the warming, which affects, certain practices that require a lot of timing, like maple sugar harvesting, which is a traditional practice. Climate change, though, in combination with stuff that, industrialized humans do, right, creates algal blooms in the Great Lakes, which affects fish habitat. And we're seeing, extreme weather events as well during different years, and feel that they're becoming more frequent or more severe. And so just in the Great Lakes, we're seeing that, certain aspects of the climate system that people came to depend on are changing in ways that make it harder to continue some of those important relationships that, I was just referencing earlier. And so, given this experience in the Great Lakes, I started working a lot more with Native folks, Indigenous people all over the place, and finding that they were having very similar types of concerns. And so I realized that there's a lot of ways to address these different concerns. So at one level, a lot of my work has focused on tribal planning. So what are we as Indigenous people doing to actually make our own preparations for climate change? No matter what the US or any other society does, how can we make climate change plans that reflect our culture, our particular political situations, and that can, be sensitive to the particular barriers that we face as tribal communities. Another aspect of my work has been to improve the quality of land-based education for Native folks. I've had a longstanding relationship with the Sustainable Development Institute at the College of Menominee Nation. The Menominee Nation is a tribe in the Great Lakes. They are related to Anishinaabe people, and have lived with, same region with Anishinaabe people for generations. And, for our work at the Sustainable Development Institute, which is an Indigenous research institute, we engage in educational programs for emerging professionals who are Native and college students to sort of center the idea that part of one's educational experience as an Indigenous person should be in the context of the successes that tribes like the Menominee have had in their environmental work. So the Menominee are well known for their forestry, their sustainable forest. And so we have educational programs in the sustainable forest where people learn from that success. And so I've worked with them for a number of years, and we've put together teams that support tribes on their climate change planning, again, kind of trying to recenter the idea that it must be the large research universities that provide that support. It could also be the tribal colleges, right, and the Indigenous run institutions. Another important piece of preparing for climate change has to do with what non-Indigenous climate scientists are doing. They have a lot of resources and institutional authority and capacity, but historically, like with most science fields, excluded Indigenous people, and especially the types of knowledge that Indigenous people have about climate change. So I've worked really hard to try to create reforms within climate science. And I'm part of several important networks, one which is called the Rising Voices, which a really important leader in that organization actually teaches at UCSB, Julie Maldonado. But it's a fantastic network that brings together climate scientists and Indigenous people to learn from each other, to exchange knowledge and to find ways that they can collaborate better. Another aspect of the work I do focuses on improving understanding and capacity for Indigenous people to pursue research on climate change or other environmental issues using research methods that come from our communities. I kind of take the approach that there's a whole bunch of different ways to understand science, and Indigenous people develop their own rigorous methods of science and peer review and knowledge systems, and so if somebody's like getting a PhD or working in another type of research context, they should be able to use those methods as well. And so I've had the privilege to work with a lot of great organizations that advance Indigenous research. One is called Napayote Maramatanga, which is a Maori Indigenous research organization. I think it's the largest Indigenous research organization in the world, and it's at each university in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and really promotes opportunities and connections and networks for Maori people to pursue research using their methods. And it expands out to all Indigenous people. One of the key events every year and a half is the International Indigenous Research Conference, which many hundreds of people convene and actually share these community-based approaches to research. And the last thing I'll mention is another key aspect of this is the policy component. There's a lot that the United States, but also international bodies could do to improve their policy with regard to climate change, both in the way that policies can affect support and funding and capacity for Indigenous preparedness for climate change. But I think also the one that probably resonates with a lot of folks in the audience is the mitigation aspect of climate change. For Native folks and many other communities share this pain. The climate change issue wouldn't really have happened if our communities were not dispossessed of our land, right? Because the fossil fuel industries, right? If it wasn't for colonialism and racial capitalism and all the different forms of exploitative labor, and so if it wasn't for all of that, these industries that we know drive climate change, they wouldn't have gotten a foothold. And so a lot of these industries, polluted or were part of the displacement directly or indirectly of our communities back in the day, right? So in that way, they committed environmental justice against us, and now they're continuing that, but based on the concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And it turns out that Indigenous people and a number of other communities who already faced social barriers and discrimination and racism also happen to be affected more severely by the destabilization that comes out of those increased concentrations of greenhouse gases. And so, in that way, there's a lot that needs to happen with regard to policy, and I'll talk about a few things now. So I just wanted to share my screen quickly for a few minutes to show you some of the stuff that I've been thinking about. And for folks attending that follow me a bit, you'll notice I've kept kind of growing in some of these ideas and getting more specific about them over time. But I'm just gonna share now. Okay. So the first thing that I wanted to note is that this map here is from the fifth national, the fourth national climate assessment, and it's a map that shows all the different actions that Indigenous people are taking in the U.S. context to address climate change. And when this was published in 2018, there were about 800 actions, and now it continues to be populated. So now it's like over 1,000, and this actually excludes a lot of mitigation actions, right? It's limited to the types of actions like listed there. And so if you included the mitigation stuff like no DAPL, move against the resistance against Dakota Access Pipeline, I mean, it would be even bigger, right? And so what this tells me, given there's 3 or 4 million Indigenous people, roughly speaking, in the U.S. context, and like 10 million people, say, in the state of Michigan. In the state of Michigan, there aren't 1,000 climate actions, right? And so this is how active Native people are, that a huge proportion of our population are actively seeking to address climate change. And, you know, there's a reason for that. Whoops. There's a reason for that. And, you know, if you look at the fourth National Climate Assessment, one of the things that, you know, you'll notice is that the chapter that's devoted to tribes and Indigenous people is a chapter that emphasizes the fact that, you know, Indigenous people are absolutely facing particularly challenging risks due to climate change. You know, so broadly speaking, you know, increases in severity of droughts, coastal erosion, changes in precipitation pattern, rises in water level, you know, these all affect, rises in water temperature, you know, these all affect Indigenous people's economies. They affect our cultures, right? Because, you know, something like water temperature and, say, fish habitat are very closely linked. And if you have an economy and a culture that's tied to certain types of fishing and fish habitat protection, then that's a pretty severe impact, right? If those fish populations are no longer able to survive in the way that they once did. But we also found, right, that there are serious, like, existential threats, you know, because for Native folks, it's not just that you get like an economic impact, but that as you lose these connections, that has an existential impact, right? Because it's your culture, it's your way of life, there are activities associated with those landscapes and those species that, like, your family, it's your family, right? So climate change is very personal. It's not an abstract type of risk. And, you know, like a lot of Native folks will say, I mean, a lot of communities are facing like climate change right now. You know, it's not just something sort of projected into the future. Now, you know, when we think about these types of issues, right, one of the things that I hear a lot of folks talking about is, isn't it the case that the rest of the world needs to, you know, to get more urgent about doing something about climate change? You know, that there's kind of the issue is sort of an emotional one. If only people cared more about it, they would do more about it, and that would potentially, you know, create a situation where if the whole world lowered its carbon footprint, then that would mitigate or lessen the types of impacts that I'm talking about that Indigenous people are facing. But, you know, what's happened is the more I started learning about the mitigation efforts that are already happening, and I attended a event actually that David Pellow was part of organizing with some fantastic colleagues a few years ago at UCSB, that, you know, folks were looking very critically using, you know, social science and case study research, that actually a lot of these solutions to climate change that lower carbon footprint, they're actually, they're pretty bad for Indigenous people in other communities, right? I mean, some types of forest conservation displace Indigenous people. Hydropower has been reinvigorated as a carbon footprint reducing solution. Hydropower has always been bad and still is for Indigenous people and communities that are nearby. But even like, you know, wind power and solar power and so on have a number of issues. They've been, you know, shown to affect environments that matter to Indigenous people. Indigenous people have been cut out of the economics and finances of those projects. And also some of the supplies for them, right, come from dubious sources that Indigenous people's values wouldn't really embrace that. And so there's lots of examples of this, but, you know, in a paper I published recently called Too Late for Indigenous Climate Justice, I cite some of this literature, but there's a lot more. It just demonstrates that that even the solutions to climate change can, you know, reinstantiate forms of racial capitalism and colonialism and patriarchy and problematic types of industrialization. And that really, I think we have to think pretty critically at whether we're not just in another time that replicates, you know, certain practices of oppression, because, you know, pretty much any type of oppression I can think of across history, the people that were perpetrating the harms, you know, they thought that they were, you know, doing something that was for like the good of other people, or, you know, something that was religious, or So I think we kind of sometimes delude ourselves today that, it must be different for us. But really, why would it be? And so, we really saw this. I was part of this report that Affiliated Tribes and Northwest Indians put together, and that has been filtering through National Congress of American Indians. It was actually an assessment from a tribal perspective of a recent climate action plan that a select committee in the House of Representatives, U.S. House of Representatives, put out on climate change. And so we reviewed the whole thing. And, literally the stuff that from a tribal perspective was being pointed out, was not so much that, about sort of the physics of climate change and whether there was like enough funding to deal with the physics of climate change, but rather most of the points have to do with the fact that, if the United States is going to move forward on climate change mitigation or adaptation planning, if there's not a strong policy of tribal consultation, then tribes will continue to be excluded or cut out. Or if there's not a respect for Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, that these plans will move forward and again sort of cut out and exclude us. Or if there's not a recognition of cultural difference and the severity of particular cultural impacts on Indigenous people, then can Native people really trust that the solutions are going to really address the particular issues that we have? And so you can go to ATNI's website on climate change and find the report and executive summary and all that. But you'll notice that most of what's in there has to do with like institutional issues and relationship issues that tribes still face. And it actually applied to a lot of other issues beyond climate change. And so when I sort of realized that, that we were kind of still in this place where we have very severe criticisms of and concerns about our treatment by the United States, but also by other entities under the jurisdiction of the United States, that all these things actually represent a lack of kinship, where kinship, for me at least, refers to a particular category or way of thinking about ethics, where a kinship relation is not just like a biological family relation. It's a particular type of ethical relation, like a responsibility that you have with many other people. Well, hopefully you have with many other people. And what's unique about it is there are relationships that even if you experience them on an individual level, that when you invest in those relationships, they create that social network that you need to be as adaptive as possible to all sorts of changes and disruptions that are happening around you. And so if you have a really good set of kinship responsibilities, then that means that there's high levels of consent and reciprocity and trust. And there's other qualities too, but it's saying that you live in a society where that there's reciprocity aplenty, there's trust aplenty, and there's respect for consent aplenty. And what's important about those qualities in particular is those are the ones you really count on when things can get really bad. Like when you have a crisis, you depend on people who your consent and their consent matters, right? That the reciprocity is there. They have your back, you have your back. That your investment in your generosity in that person is not in vain, whether they have a chance to pay you back or not, right? Or trust. And so in the examples I was talking about before, you can actually look and say, in a situation where tribes are not sure that they're truly going to be leaders in the energy transition, or whether that's an issue of trust and reciprocity, or if the U.S. government isn't going to pay attention to the particular needs that tribes have, or the risks that they face, even with the solutions to climate change, that's a consent issue, or it's also a trust issue, a reciprocity issue. And so what it suggests, right, is that as Native people, we still don't feel like we're in a situation where we have the kinship with other folks in the United States, right, especially people that represent the dominant society, the more privileged elements of society. We don't feel we have the kinship so that we can actually act together as a larger global society to address crises in ways that would avoid injustice, where, I don't think I have to defend the fact that, if something happens that's not consensual or not reciprocal or not trustworthy, and that's perpetrated systematically against certain groups of people, Indigenous people and other populations, then, that's grounds for an injustice. And so the last few things I'll just kind of, to touch on here is that, I thought that some of the reasons why, kinship is really lacking, has to do with the fact that climate change is almost always presented using like a really linear model of time, and like a time that makes it sound like there's a ticking clock and that we have to act swiftly to use technology to mitigate carbon footprint. And if we don't do that in time, the planet, is going to be destroyed. And, I realized that, from an Indigenous perspective, that's kind of not exactly a natural way to talk about climate change, and that there's different ways of speaking about the time in which climate change occurs. And so in that kind of linear way of talking about climate change like a ticking clock, it makes you feel really urgent. But just like if you're playing a game of some kind on a timer and you have to make moves like really, really quickly, you don't even have time to make your best judgment. And you certainly can't take, ethics or kinship into consideration as you could if you were playing a slower game. And so in this way, I realized that some of this urgency about climate change is very similar from other types of urgency in previous periods of colonialism. And it gets people to act so hastily that they forget about the fact that maybe what they should be urgent about is the breakdown of kinship that created the climate crisis that we understand now in the first place. And it would be needed to be restored or established anew in order to create that resilience or that sustainability so that people would be able to respond without perpetrating further injustice against the same groups that have already experienced injustice. And so a couple things I was just going to share is some of these different notions of time that I've been working with, and I'll just talk about them like super quickly. So, I've of course been like pretty inspired by folks in Indigenous studies like Mark Rifkin and Grace Dillon and Heather Davis and Zoe Todd. And there's a lot of other great folks too that have been working on time. And, you should definitely check out some of these films. You can find them on YouTube, like Becker's Sixth World, or Awakening. So definitely check those out. And, when thinking about these different Indigenous perspectives on, time, right? Like one of the things that, I realized is that, I think why Indigenous folks have been so attentive to kinship and climate change, is precisely because, for us, climate change is not something that we think is like, this is the only time it ever happened, so we actually recognize that, like if this is the red part's like 1,000 years, we're thinking about our history in terms of thousands of years, not in terms of like the 200 years of the United States. And so we recognize that we had all these disruptions at different points in our history. And in the stories a lot of Native people have, what I think is interesting is that the lessons from how people adapted to and responded to those previous crises were not that, you just you didn't have the right technology at the time, so now you have a better technology. They're actually about the fact that what you learned from the lessons is you didn't have the kinship to respond, and you need to go back to figuring out what that kinship would be. And so that's why it's funny that like when a lot of Native folks tell their different stories, and so on, and they have these lessons about like reciprocity, or trust building, we have to reframe those as the fact that notice that nobody ever thought that the solution was we need the better technology, right? And I think that's important for our time in terms of thinking about the role of justice within, climate change. And so in this way, I've looked at, some of these other models of time, right, where we kind of understand that, if the green is like 100 years, then a lot of like folks in the United States are like worried that their entire historical framework is going to get shut down, right? But actually, a lot of Indigenous people, we have previous stories of climate change, including human-caused climate change, and this is just one of them. So we try to bring all that wisdom of what we learned from those previous disruptions. And again, you find that it comes back to kinship. And so in this way, right, I've talked a little bit before about dystopian time. And so in the context of the United States, the early colonial people didn't think they could, conquer Indigenous people. So they would have fantasized about the state of affairs right now. And we're living in what is their fantasy, right? But that's the entire expanse of that history. But for Indigenous people, we're, in this dystopia, and we recognize that we're past dystopias that people moved out of. So, it's a different perspective, right, of understanding climate change. And this is something that's frustrating with how people talk about the pandemic. They say, oh, well, when are we going to return to normal? Well, in a situation where, you know, Black people, Latinx people, Indigenous people were already more vulnerable to exposure and to illness, that's not a norm. Was that ever a normal situation? So I don't want to go back to that situation, right? It's similar with climate change, right? If Indigenous people are more vulnerable than others, we don't want to maintain that status quo. That's the dystopian time. Um, you know, so just lastly, a couple quick slides, you know, thinking about time as well, right? A lot of folks talk about how Indigenous people have a great understanding of the seasons, you know, but remember, when people think in terms of seasons, they're not just thinking in terms of this change in weather corresponds to this change in plant or fish, but they're actually talking about time in a way where the whole year different social activities and cultural activities are changing, and the changes and the transitions of those activities support further connection among people, support further kinship. And so seasonal time is time about constant kinship changing. And it actually, and I'll fast forward a little bit, that if you can tell time solely through changes in kinship. So you could actually, and if you've ever heard like an elder or another knowledge keeper tell a really good story, they'll tell whole histories of time unfolding just in terms of the escalation and de-escalation of kinship. So when did climate change start? Well, if land dispossession occurred in the 19th century that created those industries, that was a huge time of a de-escalation of kinship, because land dispossession means disrespect for consent, disrespect for reciprocity. That's what made it possible. So it was a de-escalation of kinship. And then now we're in a period of time where we're dealing with the wake of that de-escalation and trying to hopefully escalate kinship. But the last deal this closes, if you think about that, right? But, you know, someone I read a lot named Mary Arquette, who's a veterinarian, environmental scientist, philosopher, traditionalist, Haudenosaunee. If you commit to that view, though, and this is an article called The Animals, from a book from a couple decades ago on Haudenosaunee environmental philosophy. But if you think about the escalation and de-escalation of kinship, you know, Arquette reflects on the fur trade and Indigenous people's role in the devastation of the environment in the fur trade. And here she actually meditates that perhaps the breach of kinship was so deep that we might not recover from it. And this is when some of my work I call the kinship tipping point, right? Is that we also have to acknowledge that kinship takes time to develop, but it can be very quickly unraveled, and that maybe we're in a situation where it's going to take so long to redevelop kinship that some of the worst climate change impacts will happen. So anyways, these are some of the things I wanted to share with you all. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Kyle. This is so relevant, more relevant than you know in some ways. Some of my students are watching, and we've been talking a lot about Indigenous prophetic traditions and the cycling of time and thinking beyond settler time. So the way you hinge this to questions about the environment is fascinating. Thank you. Well, David, please jump in and let's see where the conversation goes. And we can go till, you know, after 6 until we have a queue of questions that we should address. Let's just talk.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Greg. Kyle, as always, whenever I hear you speak, I'm inspired, I'm moved. I'm always walk away from the conversation enriched. So thank you, as always. This is a powerful, wide-ranging presentation, as always. Kinship, time, reciprocity, consent, deep ways of thinking and rethinking of our relationship to our life support systems and to other social movements, and so much more. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, or have you talk a little bit about the role of knowledge, and to build on what you've already said, which has been so impactful. You know, the push by many Native leaders and scholars for the support and recognition, for example, of traditional environmental knowledge. I mean, it goes without saying that it's extremely important on a number of fronts. And for me, you know, as a settler, as a non-Indigenous person, I mean, I see it as a way of recognizing the importance of often subjugated and oppressed and suppressed knowledge and ideas, but also language, right, and practices in the work of building equitable and sustainable communities. And I should also say I'm really proud to report that here at UCSB, we have a traditional environmental knowledge course being taught this year by Margaret McMurtry, who's a scholar and Indigenous community leader here. So I'm really happy about that. But in my view, some of the lessons of traditional environmental knowledge really translate quite nicely and powerfully to so many other movements, right? Environmental justice movement, climate justice movement, food justice movement, because part of it for me underscores the importance of people who are on the front lines being given the space or taking and reclaiming the space to define their realities for themselves and to lead and define solutions for themselves. And this is so much of what you've been talking about. And so whether it's farm worker communities facing herbicides, pesticides, whether it's Black and brown communities fighting polluting coal-fired power plants, any of these communities that are fighting for justice on any number of fronts, the idea that we speak for ourselves seems really important to me. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about how traditional environmental knowledge is really critical to realizing environmental justice, and maybe talk more about that relationship.
Great, and thanks, David, for the question. When folks kind of look up some of the literature on Indigenous knowledge or traditional knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, a lot of the available literature, I don't think kind of gives us the right idea. It sort of treats that knowledge as like a alternative form of data that can improve science, right? But what's the actual problem with science in relation to organizing and activism and crises and so on? It's not really that much about the data or the information of science. It's that a lot of dominant science institutions, like some of the universities I've worked at or studied at, were somehow fostered to create these sort of ivory tower type of environments, right? And what's interesting about Indigenous knowledge systems, and this absolutely extends to the knowledge systems of many other communities, right? Whether they're Indigenous in different ways, or diasporic communities, or communities who face other situations, is that actually there wouldn't be any such thing as even the pretension of an ivory tower in the knowledge system. So actually, why is that? And recently I put up online, I think, a draft paper that's coming out that's titled "Sciences of Consent." One of the points I was making there, right, is that in some Indigenous knowledge systems, something like consent, like free, prior, and informed consent, is not actually like a restriction on science or an ethic that sort of regulate science, but actually consent is considered part of the empirical process itself, so that you couldn't actually make a statement like there's really good knowledge out there that came from very violent research, because from Indigenous perspective that wouldn't count as knowledge, because if knowledge is supposed to serve kinship, then knowledge must be associated with efforts that would improve consent or reciprocity, right? So a form of knowledge that occurred through theft or exploitation or denigration of another knowledge system doesn't actually improve kinship, does it? And this is related to the fact that one of the biggest challenges of science and engineering right now in a country like the United States, but also others as well, is not that the solutions that they come up with aren't related to the problems, but that the solutions don't get distributed equally or fairly, or that not everybody gets to be involved in how the solutions are designed. And again, that's a kinship problem, that's a justice problem. And a lot of knowledge systems from other cultures would not have understood their knowledge systems as being susceptible to that issue, because their knowledge systems were not ones that excluded people. Everybody knew that the knowledge keepers were trained in a certain way, had passed through certain tests and hoops and experiences to get to the point where they are. And those knowledge holders are accountable to all layers of community of people who are affected by the results. So instead of two, anonymous peer reviewers being like judges for whether your work passes as knowledge, you have entire communities that are. And a key part of that, next, I think that especially relates to the point that you made, David, is that in a lot of Indigenous knowledge systems, it's not just like adults of a certain training that are considered to be knowledge holders. You know, everybody's considered to be a knowledge holder, so that when I'm in contexts where I think people are really taking seriously their Indigenous knowledge systems, you know, if a child says something, whereas like if a child said something in some of the academic classrooms I've been in, people would just laugh that, oh, that's so funny and so cute. But actually, right, in Indigenous knowledge system and many others, if a child says something and people are initially confused by it, that's an opportunity to actually figure out what's going on. And when you talk through it, actually, oftentimes it turns out that that child is pointing out something that you've taken for granted. And same to go right with anybody. And, you know, part of the problem with what happens in environmental justice is that activists who represent communities on the ground facing struggles, they communicate things that more privileged scientists don't even think are possible, right? Either it's something that's so bad or so idiosyncratic or they never imagine it. And because a lot of times scientists or policymakers aren't attuned to thinking about a more inclusive knowledge system, they take an arrogant or exclusive stance on that. And people from communities understand that and they distrust it, right? And so I think, you know, Indigenous knowledge systems, but again, knowledge systems are governed by the same types of things I'm mentioning that come from many other communities based on what they've had to develop to be able to adapt to the circumstances around us. They provide us models of an alternative way of thinking about knowledge systems. And it's one that we could really use right now.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's a powerful answer. It reminds me of conversations I've had with my sister-in-law, who's a medical doctor, who talked about being in medical school and being faced with this ethical dilemma of medical knowledge that has been derived directly from the torture of Indigenous peoples, of Jews during the Nazi Holocaust, of African Americans, et cetera. I mean, the science of gynecology, for crying out loud, right, is largely driven by that. And so that's a real ethical dilemma. Also reminds me of something I read long ago that Winona LaDuke has stated and written many times, right, that, and I'll probably mess this up, but that sustainable knowledge is a foundation, a necessary foundation of a sustainable community. And I think you've articulated that very powerfully. So maybe related to that, I wanted to pick up on a theme that you touched on in your presentation tonight, and that is scholar activism and community collaboration, which seem to be very, very core to much of the work that you do. And that's one of the many, many reasons why I admire you. And I think it's also important, if I can say, because you're an Indigenous scholar, you're an Indigenous studies scholar, and you're a humanities scholar. And so I wondered if you could say a little bit about how you approach that work, that community collaborative work, the activist scholar work, however you might define it. And maybe discuss, some tensions, maybe some successes, and how you manage or even bring those ideas, those identities together.
Yeah, thanks for your question, David. Yeah, I think that there's been, and I think a lot of folks have been, kind of clued into this sort of conversation about, what it means to be somebody that works in like higher education or in universities, right? But based on your background and community experience, you just realize that those institutions, those research universities, those higher ed institutions just don't really check out with, the values or the ways of life or the types of goals that, represent your community. And so that represent those of your community. And so the way I kind of have understood it, and I think I'm still in the phase of figuring out and reflecting on this, is that, when you're somebody who is really trying to, stand up for your community for the sake of justice, for the sake of safety and empowerment, that in a place like the United States, you have a whole bunch of options available to you about where you might work or what you might do, and you can do a ton of approaches, right? I mean, you could work in a university, you could start your own business, you could start your own campaign or movement, you could work in private industry, right? You could work for 501c3 or 501c4. So you have all these options available to you. And I think one of the most important things is that whenever you go down one of those roads, almost all those institutions try to get you to think that their particular way of doing things should be your goal. So like academia is one of the best examples of that. Like, when did publishing become the goal? Right? It becomes an end. Publishing is not an end. It has to be a means to something, right? And what's it a means to? Well, if you're interested in scholar activism or scholar organizing, then your goals are those actual social goals, right? Those political goals, those environmental goals, however you want to understand them. And so what's important to note, right, is that you always want to remain focused on those particular goals, and you have to constantly have a very honest conversation with yourself about how much you can tolerate the constraints of the current institution you happen to be in. And so I know folks, they have no toleration for academia, so they move on. Some stick it out and regret it a bit, right, but are happy when they move out. For some reason, the way I was born or built or whatever it is, I can tolerate the stuff in academia. I mean, I don't like it, but I'm able to do it. And so in that way, what I've really tried to do is, stick to my goals, stick to my values, and find ways that the capacities in universities, the people that I have the privilege to work with in universities, that we can mobilize together and empower each other. And I'm also have been prepared that, maybe this won't work out, right? And so I think that's another important thing. If you're going to be a real, in some ways, a real kind of dedicated scholar activist or scholar organizer, you have to know under what conditions you're ready to be fired. When do you compromise? When do you not compromise? And you need to be able to tell people about that so that they know that's what you're about. It doesn't matter what your values are, obviously within a certain range, but people need to know what you stand for and what you're willing to negotiate on. And so that's been particularly important. And really what I've tried to do is, at any institution I've been at, is really demonstrate that the work I'm doing is actually advancing not only my goals, but the social mission of the university, right? Universities aren't supposed to be functioning like for profit. If you look at their mission statements, they're actually social missions, whether it's public or private. And so I think we actually, as people doing scholar activism and scholar organizing, that we're really in the position to say that what we're trying to do is consistent with what the university, and that perhaps actually we're seeing beyond some of these things that have been swapped out as the ends, when they're not really the ends, they're just the means. And so publishing, right? What does it mean to think very carefully about how you publish and where you publish? I know folks that, because of their agenda, that means all their publications go in like Science and Nature. And that could be a very good strategy if you have certain ends, right? But if you have other types of ends, other publication venues, could even be artistic venues, might be better. So in that way, we have to look at all the different options we have in the higher ed institutions and figure out how they're mobilized as instruments, and not emotionally buy into them as ends.
Wow. Could I impress upon you to maybe at a later date come and give a presentation to the university's Committee on Academic Personnel to push them to broaden and deepen their understanding of what the goals of what we're doing here might embrace? I really appreciate that, thinking about publishing not as the end at all, and maybe only a means, and a very, very troubling means in some ways to other ends. I really appreciate that. And I say that also in the capacity of a department chair right now, undergoing a season of merits and promotions and reviews and evaluations in my faculty, many of them asking similar questions. And I think I'm sure some of them are here tonight and would be inspired. So it's about 56 after the hour. We've got a number of questions in the queue there. So I think I'm going to just ask one final question, and then I'll turn it back over if Greg wants to rejoin us, if that's okay. Kyle, you mentioned earlier in your presentation, the fact that there's important coalitions among and across various groups, whether it's environmental justice, indigenous sovereignty, and other movements and aims. And for me, this is really important because indigenous movements for sovereignty and environmental justice have, in my view, really forced us to sort of rethink and redefine that problematic timeline of environmental justice movements in what we now call the United States, which, as you know, of course, is for far too long sort of settled for this origin myth that the environmental justice movement really began when African American civil rights leaders rose up in the 1980s, against this toxic landfill expansion in Warren County, North Carolina. And of course, super important moment, really a defining moment for this movement. But of course, we know there's some problems with that. I mean, many people have pointed out that arguably the environmental justice movement, at least in this hemisphere, began at least some 500 years ago with the first resistance efforts against European invasion. But even if we were to acknowledge or buy into that first part of the story, that North Carolina, that origin story is where this movement began, then we would also at least have to acknowledge that struggle by African Americans and other folks, their allies, took place on indigenous, Haliwa, Tuscarora, Saponi lands. And so for me, this reflects long-standing points of tension. You and I were on a panel at the University of Sydney this summer, and you mentioned, anti-Blackness among some communities of indigenous peoples during this panel. I have publicly critiqued, as have other folks, groups like the Republic of New Africa, a Black liberation group that has declared that its territory, is going to be the southeastern United States, which of course is a little bit problematic since those are indigenous homelands. So I wonder if you could speak to some maybe important tensions and maybe positive collaborations that have occurred between indigenous, environmental justice, and other movements, particularly among people of color, and particularly at this moment where this term BIPOC has emerged with such force. And I just wonder how you navigate some of those challenges.
Yeah, great. And I'm glad that you gave that prompt, David, because I was hoping that we could all, connect on this. And hoping to hear too more about your thoughts too on that, David, though your question included quite a bit of your thoughts. So I appreciate you taking the time to, to share that. So, for me, I have a lot on that. So I'll just, I'll focus on a few things because, a lot of the work that I do, is in kind of that coalitional space, especially as it connects Indigenous people and Black people within the U.S. context, but also other groups as well, especially in the state of Michigan, where I've worked for some time on environmental justice policy and organizing. And so I found, a couple things. So first of all, with respect to like some of those histories of environmental justice where I guess within certain types of dominant academic paradigms, right? I guess the more prominent examples are, activist movements, organizings by Black people, by African Americans. I think that we want to be in the position to say at exactly the same time, right, that there's environmental justice that's centered in African American organizing, activism, policy change, grassroots community development, right? And that features these tremendous cultural and social institutions, the church institutions, the organizations, the neighborhoods, right? So I think we want to be able to say that, right? So I think we want to be able to center Black sovereignty as a key aspect of these movements. We should also be able to, at the same time, right, talk about how movements like 200 years ago, or even before that, that were led by Indigenous people that might not have used the term environmental justice, right, are also old and originary environmental justice movements. And it's no different from the fact that, I know so many Indigenous people that, in the last year, all they've been talking about is Black Lives Matter. So we know, right, that a lot of groups are struggling with police violence too, but I can confidently say, and many other people, that it's important to say Black Lives Matter right now. The same way that many African Americans I knew during the struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline, they were saying no DAPL, right? But we all know, right, that African Americans have been subject to violence from pipelines too, right? And so I think it's important to be able to support each other and to be confident that we can refer directly and sometimes exclusively, right, to each other's struggles, because we understand, we know that it's a different picture, we know it's a broader picture, it's more diversity, but it's very important to hold people up and lift people up in the moment. And another thing I think is important, and I've been definitely challenged by a lot of important points that, colleagues of mine, who are African American have raised about, certain ways that different types of like indigenous thought or customs can be, anti-diasporic, right? Because it's kind of strange if you think about it, right? That actually, say for, I mean, a lot of people of color, but I'll just focus on, some African American communities. I mean, their history in, what's currently the United States goes back to like the 1600s. For many Native people, our, way of understanding our cultural history, we have many land-based traditions that come from that same time period, right? And so I think it's important to note that a lot of aspects, dimensions, histories tied to African American communities have, centuries of history, and they're land-based, and that actually the fact that a diasporic community that experienced, some of the severest forms of labor exploitation and dehumanization has a land-based connection, has land-based knowledge, and has ongoing traditions over hundreds of years of exercising different forms of self-determination. That's a history that a lot of our, privileged kind of white or settler colleagues have wanted to exclude. And I found it telling, and I know we discussed this at that event that you referenced, David, that, if you look at a lot of environmental fields, there's always this track for, indigenous knowledge. I wouldn't say that's a great place to be, right? It's not like that's some amazing field or some amazing like respect, for, but right. But at the same time, how come there aren't tracks, tied to the diversity of African American knowledge systems, right? Or Latinx knowledge, right? Well, I think that they're actually using us, right? Because they believe that by at least holding up in a limited way this indigenous tradition, then they feel like they're somehow doing their part and that they can exclude everybody else, right? So they don't have to admit, the further violence that they're associated with. And that's why a lot of folks, I mean, people like Carolyn Finney and others have written about the environmental exclusion of Black people and how there's so much silence around that. And it's sad to say that, a lot of people, as little as they know of indigenous dispossession, they oftentimes might have more to say about indigenous dispossession than about all the other communities, right? And so the last thing I'll just say is that, I think these dialogues about shared history are important because one of the issues is that, especially with, like white Americans, that have really created this myth that for communities of color and indigenous communities, that our best allies or collaborators must be the powerful, white people, right? European people, and settler people. But really our best allies are probably each other. And we see this in so many different ways. I mean, if we mobilize together as different, people that experience, different but hauntingly similar types of barriers and that experience intersectional forms of oppression. And we can actually talk about the fact that, racism is experienced in different ways, but interlocking ways. Settler colonialism is experienced in different ways by different communities. It's not just like an indigenous thing. If we can have that conversation and figure out how we can work together, there's so much possibility, because I always feel as somebody that, especially a lot of my work with the Michigan Environmental Justice Coalition in Michigan, which is a people of color and indigenous run coalition. It's now involved in numerous environmental and climate justice projects, and we have to navigate this space on a daily basis. And one of the things that recently happened is we had an environmental justice summit, which we do every year and a half. And we had a number of events that were organized around the idea that it was going to be a people of color and indigenous space. And so the materials that were created used the term BIPOC. And one of the important things I learned from that, right, is that for a lot of folks, when they saw the idea of BIPOC, right, Black, Indigenous, people of color, in a context like the United States, I think it did convey an important message that, you know, Indigenous and Black people, we have a special connection to these lands, right? And that there is a sense in which I think, you know, I'd encourage other groups, I guess, to be in this conversation as well. That there's a way that that's understood, that is not necessarily a problematic, you know, privileging, or it shouldn't be taken in that way. Though at the same time, it just to me is strange to think that you have two more specific designators, right, and in a broader people of color. But, you know, that's the space we're in, right? I mean, that's the intersectional space, because we can't avail ourselves of totalizing concepts, right? And so what we found is that there were cases where people understood that that term was an invitation, but that once you're in the space, nobody uses that term, right? So I would never introduce somebody as a BIPOC, you know, scholar, writer, person. But then there are other people who did say that they actually couldn't get through the more specific meaning of the term. And not people that would be in the people of color category, but Black and Indigenous persons conveyed that they were uncomfortable with that, both because of a potential privileging, but also because it didn't say anything specific about their identities. And so I think that's a very important aspect of the environmental justice organizing, is how to navigate this conceptual and terminological terrain that can either be welcoming or it can be denigrating for some.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for that rich and extraordinary response. And yes. Oh, and by the way, congratulations on your recent move to the University of Michigan from MSU. That's big news in the world of environmental justice studies. And yeah, I've got in addition to yourself, a number of friends and colleagues working on environmental justice in the state of Michigan, and y'all are really leading the way in so many important ways. So I'm going to invite Greg, if he's around, to rejoin the conversation. Greg, welcome back. Did you want to jump in? I'm happy to.
Thank you, guys. While this conversation, I think I can speak for our audience that we just want to hear you two talk all night long. I'm learning so much, so rich. Thank you both. Well, we have a great roster of questions, some at a very large scale, others very specific to research practices on campuses. I love it. Of course, I invite you both to field the questions yourselves, but I can also direct traffic. Maybe to get things going, I'll point to one that's at this larger scale, and then we can drill down to some of the more specific ones. And I'll do that by way of welcoming an incoming faculty member of David Pellow's program in environmental studies, Lisa Sedaris. She's asked a great question. I can't wait to have her on campus, partly because the Department of Religious Studies can draw her in for some of our own purposes of engagement and learning. So you can see your question there, but she's asking, Kyle, the way you frame things, she asks, how do we convey a sense of urgency about climate change without sacrificing kinship and reciprocity as fundamental values whose neglect drives climate change itself? Can we balance these, or is urgency just the wrong framework?
Great, and yeah, good to hear from Lisa. I've got a connection on several projects with Lisa, and yeah, congratulations on your new position as well. From going to a couple of events at UCSB, I know the fantastic folks that are there, so it's that's going to be fantastic. Yeah, so the way that I've understood it is, you know, I've actually thought it's ironic that the object of somebody's urgency would be like climate change. Like, am I urgent about the climate change impact or the climate change trend? As opposed to being urgent already about the fact that we know we live in a world where we're not even prepared to deal with any crisis, whether it's climate change or not. So I think we can actually be urgent about kinship, like being urgent about justice. But I think that the challenge there, right, is that if we are really urgent about kinship or justice, I think we have to change our perspective on the length of time it will take to create a solution to something. So for example, if you work in a university, and you're urgent about improving kinship between that university and say tribes, tribal governments, tribal peoples, if you're urgent about that repair, is that going to be solvable even within one's career? Maybe not, right? There might be some things that can be done, but to actually repair the trust, right, that takes time. It's so different from our experiences working in our particular institutional arrangements where you have decades or generations of hostility and hierarchy. If you're serious about repairing those issues, and we see this in some of the current university initiatives to hire people who work in anti-racism areas or social justice areas, right? Universities for a long, long time have been hostile to people that work in those areas. And just because you now are in a position to make a hire in that area because people have been reminded about how bad things are, if you haven't improved the kinship in those departments, are we really going to solve the problem that these important areas of research are not sufficiently respected by, different faculties? And so, when I think I talk to folks and including a lot of scientists, I think what's shocking is that, whether it's with climate change or, whether it's say with racism today, like what happened when the media and the social media brought to light these awful, murders by the police, is that so many people like why weren't they already clued into the fact that that's been happening, right? Why weren't they already urgent about that? Why are they urgent now? Why weren't they urgent last year? Or in some of these conversations on campuses, right? The reason why there are things like Indigenous studies departments is because in the 60s, the 70s, I mean, each year I can tell you, in each decade I can tell you, a social movement that was public and that hit these campuses hard and led to institutional change. Yet why has everybody forgotten about that? And so I think these are the things that we need to be urgent about. And so if we're urgent about kinship, it relates to any such crisis, climatic or not. Thanks, Lisa.
Wow. Yeah, thank you. And that actually heads in the direction of a series of questions about how universities might better relate to Indigenous peoples in our areas and to the research conducted here and elsewhere in the name of the university. Chumash concerns are raised by several questioners, but I think in general, these questions are asking you to help us think about how to foster better kinship, better relationships with local Native peoples at the level of our research agendas, institutional spending, basically how are local Indigenous peoples better enfranchised in university settings in productive ways. Maybe you can point to some experiences you've had that point in that direction.
Yeah, no, and that's of course, a question that, there's both, I think cases of change within universities is very positive, but there's also a sense that it relates to the, particular situations of the homelands of the actual people, right, and that the university has taken, right, in that particular relationship. And I'm just looking through some of these comments, and actually see some folks I think I connected with as well in previous visits to California. So I won't call them out because they haven't been named. Don't want to put anybody on the spot. I see you all there. But anyways, the first thing that needs to be noted, right, is, and it's a little bit related to what I discussed before, but there's a reason why there aren't a lot of Indigenous students in universities, and oftentimes when they do come, they don't stay. There's a reason why there's not a lot of Indigenous faculty, why there's not a lot of programs, right, where there's all these other departments, all these other topics, and there could be like one, Native Studies department. It's usually not a department, right? There's actually only a few Indigenous studies departments in the the entire world, right? And so there's a reason why that is, and it has to do with the actual overall setup of the university, so that you can't take that setup and ignore it and then create a specific program attempting to recruit students or to set up a new research project, because Native people don't see the program, they see the entire setup, right? I think that's been something that, you know, I've been challenging a lot of folks to think about. I mean, it's similar to diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, right? You know, people seem to pretend that if a university sets up one of those initiatives, that the people who are the intended beneficiaries of that, they just see that initiative and they think, fantastic. They don't. They see the whole university and they see the whole setups change, right? And they see things like, well, how come there's not as much faculty associated with that program, right? Or, you know, how come it's so much smaller, right? We don't see the program and think things are solved. We see the whole setup, right? The whole setup is not good. And I mean, to be honest, right? I mean, you know, if we want to really get into some of the challenges of the setup of many universities, you know, how can we genuinely create a welcoming environment when just the campuses themselves are so incredibly ridiculous? And, you know, I shouldn't have to say this to folks that work in a UC environment, right? Modeled after, I'm not an architecture person, but you know where I'm going with that, right? I mean, you know, but it's the same campus, right? It's not any one campus somewhere, right? They're all imitating forms of architecture that are deeply colonial and haven't invested in any sort of physical space. And even where that kind of physical investment of Indigenous, you know, centering and so on occurs on certain campuses, it's still like one thing, and surrounded by all these strange forms of architecture that are trying to imitate other forms of architecture and just really don't have a moral connection to that, you know, landscape, right? You know, I think we're also universities, and, you know, I've worked at 2 universities that, you know, we now know we're promoting people to very high offices, whether it's the highest academic office or whether it was a top academic office who had reported, you know, widely reported and known issues tied to, you know, harassment and abuse. And so you look at that and you're like, well, what kind of, you know, rigorous academic system is that? I mean, it wasn't as if some of these things were totally secretive, right? They were documented, and it still persisted. And so things like that, right? And the universities haven't reckoned with those things, and they haven't reckoned adequately with them, and they haven't actually engaged with them that much beyond sort of the basic legal safeguards they've had to put in place to stop horrendous abuses after they'd already occurred over generations. And so I think in this case, right, you know, universities, and I've seen this in discussions I have with colleagues, right? They think that by putting more money into certain types of initiatives and advertising them and claiming that if you're in one of the initiatives, you're going to be safe and you're going to be okay, that somehow obscures the fact that the overall setup is really looking pretty bad from the perspective of the supposed beneficiaries for those particular programs. And you know, so I remember in some university settings I've been in, when the issue of equity or justice or diversity comes up, all of a sudden the faculty want to be the best at it, right? Well, we want our university to be known as the most diverse or the most just. But how can you say that when the university's own house is not in order, right? Yeah. I don't care how much funding is put into equity if I don't feel safe. You know, and so my answer is that, and is to research or education or mentorship or anything, is that until those things get solved, we're going to have to just come clean about them and not try to cover them up and obscure them. And we're going to have to be adamant about making change and not forget about them once the wound, you know, kind of gets ripped off and, you know, partially scars or heals again. We need to keep those as the major discussions. We need to address why our universities are some of the worst places of human rights abuses of any institution on the planet, right? If that's not fixed, then I don't see how a decolonized or anti-colonized research educational program can honestly exist.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Thank you. so clarifying to hear you say it just like that. And I would say that I would just add to that, and dovetailing with a few of the questions here, that universities ask of our faculty that we meet certain IRB requirements and so forth. But how is it that universities relate to Indigenous peoples in our presence by way of those kinds of academic expectations? And to add another piece to it, shouldn't universities be accountable to similar standards in their own investment practices, and when they engage in projects elsewhere, hold themselves to the same standards that they claim to hold their own faculty to in their individual research? So just flagging some of the other kinds of double standards that permeate the academy that we can all work to apply pressure to, it seems to me. And I really loved what you said earlier about that. That's not some radical move. That's asking universities to live up to their very mission. And that's what I signed up for. So great, thank you. Please, David, do you want to ask one of these questions?
Sure. Thanks so much, Kyle, for that incredible response. I just snapping my fingers, and particularly, given that we are at a public university, I think everything you said is is even truer. And of course, here in the University of California, and you and I and Greg earlier today had an email exchange. We're dealing, of course, with the struggle to defend Mauna Kea on the island of Hawaii, and the 30-millimeter telescope, and how this university, not just UC, but UCSB in particular, is deeply embroiled in that in very troubling and problematic ways. So I think everything you said really applies to that as well. So we've got a question from a colleague who's asking if you can talk a bit about the Green New Deal. I'll connect that to a related framework. So the question is basically, in defending the Green New Deal, Congressperson Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has at least mentions Indigenous contributions and traditional environmental practices. The question being asked is then, being optimistic for the moment, how do you see this playing out in the Green New Deal? What I would add to that is that I know you're aware of course, the Red Deal, which has been framed not so much as a counter program to the Green New Deal, but really a call for action beyond the scope of the U.S. colonial state. And so in many ways, we see the Red Deal and the Green New Deal, I think, existing in maybe a productive tension as one seeks to go beyond the nation state and beyond capitalism. And the other, for all of its beauty and its intentions, the Green New Deal is deeply wedded to both of those. So I wondered what your thoughts might be on that, and how, of course, that relates to questions of Indigenous futures.
No. So I do interact. It's kind of not like a whole focus of mine, but I do interact quite a bit with like the Biden-Harris, campaign, now obviously the transition. And, I do, through some work, the federal government, more under Obama, and obviously there was the 4-year gap when everything I was doing ended, and now things may come back, or different things will come up. So it is something I keep pretty closely connected to. And I think there's a couple ways to to look at it. And with respect to the Green New Deal, I appreciate the fact that a number of the people who support it, do recognize the Indigenous dimension or aspect to it. The question is, as it's implemented, whether they're going to have the right people part of it who are educated about the actual barriers that tribal governments and Indigenous people face in terms of emerging as leaders in the energy transition. So the energy transition can't just be clean energy, but the same dependence. And so there's a literature that, like in my Too Late article, and probably a couple other articles I've published, I need to post some of the references to online just in general, that looks very carefully at why certain renewable energy programs sponsored by the US government, why they were tribally focused, but ultimately didn't lead to a new sort of energy situation that tribes face a number of different types of barriers having to do with legal issues, with financial issues, economic issues. And so really, if the Green New Deal is going to make good on some of its promises in its implementation through future iterations, is going to have to really come clean about the fact that the tribal sector is one that has very particular barriers and very particular needs. And they need to recognize, and a colleague at Santa Clara University, Catherine Sandoval, has written about this, that a lot of tribes are even just cut out of the basic energy grid setup to begin with. And so that issue needs to be addressed as well. So that's one aspect of it. Now, in terms of the, is it the Red Deal or is it the Red New Deal, right? Or I'm very familiar with it. You threw me off, and I could Google it right now. But anyways, so the work that like the Red Nation and other allies and colleagues does, is tremendously important because, on the one hand, it's very aware and fully understands how the U.S. federal system works in terms of its articulation of tribal sovereignty, right? Yet it articulates very practical solutions that, on the one hand, they absolutely go beyond racial capitalism and settler colonialism and other forms of power, but they're very pragmatic as to how actual communities and neighborhoods, and different other coalitions can come together to create a different future. And to me, it really speaks to the idea, and I think this is something that is betrayed actually in the New Deal, that I think for some communities, right, we're not, and I mentioned this before, we're not trying to preserve right now, we're trying to get something better. And so it's a different way of understanding crisis, right? We went through a crisis before, we've had multiple crises, we're in a crisis now, but we're trying to get to something better. We're not scared about losing something of today per se, right? Because we don't want to put a lot of energy into protecting an unjust situation. And so I think the Green New Deal still kind of, smacks of that, assumption of normalcy. Whereas I think something like the Red New Deal, on the other hand, is not buying into that. And I think if people that advocate for the Green New Deal really thought about how the Red New Deal interacts with the current way of doing things in the United States, including the actual cultural situations that many of us are in and what it means for our own organizing and mobilization, then, it's something that can be used practically by people everywhere.
Wow. Thank you, Kyle. Time is running its course. I'm going to take the privilege of asking a last very brief question here, seeking a brief answer. How do we best support something like the land back movement? That is, drilling down to the brass tacks here. Any kind of real justice for the sorts of questions we've been raising going to be hinged at some point to land reparations. That may seem like pie in the sky, but at the end of the day, that's what needs to be addressed. And the land back movement's headed us in that direction. Kyle, in your view, what concrete steps might we take in the short run to help a movement like that succeed?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. I really think, and this is, kind of a reflection on a lot of folks I know who are, indigenous to, to what's currently, California, is, for indigenous people everywhere, based on their experiences with, colonialism, we all have different, governing capacities and different types of recognition. Some tribes have a lot of, what's called trust land, land that's recognized as sovereign in various respects by the United States. Some tribes have treaties that aren't ratified, that don't have trust lands. Some are not recognized at all by the United States. And while certainly our sovereignty, our cultural integrity doesn't come from the US, right? It's more of a kinship and a diplomatic point, right? That sovereigns should, recognize sovereigns. I think it's ironic that Native people do show respect to to others, and to sovereigns, right? But we're oftentimes not given that respect back, right? And that's a big thing for us to do, given that there's a lot of reasons to challenge the legitimacy, right, of U.S. sovereignty, to put it mildly. And so I think that, part of a land back move is actually we really need to provide each Indigenous people, each community, each tribal nation with the support they need to begin to scaffold, right, to where they need to be able to exercise that governance and that stewardship. And, a lot of colleagues I have in California, I mean, they're working at ground zero, right? I mean, they're surrounded by these, foreign infrastructures and not a lot of recognition of their lands and their territories, not a lot of political rights and so on. And so that, California really is ground zero for, human rights abuses against Indigenous people, despite how many people in the state, portray it. And that's saying a lot, right? I come from Michigan, right? And that's my perspective on California. And so I think that the land back movement, needs to look very carefully about what it actually means to be self-governing, and what are the steps that need to be taken to grow those capacities, and to do it in a kinship way, and to do it in a way that actually leads to people over time being able to be present on the lands that matter to them. And then to create those diplomatic traditions. And this is another thing where a lot of Indigenous people are very generous, is Indigenous people typically haven't tried to displace settler populations or threaten them. And again, that's like, theoretically, I guess, that's kind of can be a hard pill to swallow, but I think that's kind of the ethic that a lot of Native folks bring. And it would be good to get some of that, respect in return.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you for that. And yeah, it's always important to reframe where we are in particular and understand our histories in just those ways. I want to thank you both, Professor Whyte, Professor Pellow. I've enjoyed this evening and learned a lot. I know the audience has. Audience, I wish we got to all of your questions, but trust me, to have such questions tells me this was a great success, and there's a lot left to do, many more conversations to have. So thanks everyone for joining us. Please come in the winter and join what we have going on then. And may everybody have a good night and a good week. Okay, take care and thank you.